Honesty with God. When we are distressed, confused, and frustrated with life's circumstances, we should feel free to share our true feelings with God. Here's Gene.
To understand this principle, we need a larger perspective. A larger perspective that really leads up to the events that we're going to look at in the chapter where we see this principle illustrated. And generally speaking, in order to understand that, we know in studying the results of crises that people go through stages of grief. Well, here in this book, authored so many years ago, we see Job going through these stages of grief. So let me illustrate that. For example, in chapter 2, Job was in deep shock. See, that's one of the first things that happens in a crisis. There's shock. And in Job's case, when you realize what happened to him, it's incredible, the shock that he was in. But that's normal. And then in chapter 3, he began to ask why, again and again, trying to understand the reasons for his personal tragedy. You know, once people move through shock, then they begin to think, and they begin to reason, and they try to figure out why. Why did this happen? Well, we see that being true in Job's life. And then in chapter 6 and 7, his disillusionment, which led to all of those why questions, his disillusionment now turned to anger. Anger against Eliphaz for judging him, and even towards God for allowing these calamities and disasters to happen. Anger is a part of the stages of grief. In fact, I get concerned about people who go through serious crises and they don't appear to be angry. They don't seem to go through phases of anger. And the fact of the matter is that can be dangerous. Because what it can simply mean is they're not in touch with their feelings. And in some instances, they've been taught that we shouldn't be angry, therefore they don't allow themselves to be angry, and yet God has created this emotion, and that's why Paul said, be angry, but don't sin in the process. So we see Job going through this anger. And now in chapters 9 and 10, Job's anger gave way to a sense of hopelessness. Just absolute hopelessness. He felt trapped. He felt isolated from God, even though he had lived an upright life. But at this point, he's getting to the place where the healing process can begin. Now, even though this is a very unusual situation, isn't it interesting that Job went through these stages of grief? And we need to understand that when people are in these stages of grief, then they need to feel free to share their true feelings with God. And here's where people can get very, very covered up with guilt because they have these feelings, but they don't feel free to share them. Well, Job illustrates that freedom. And remember now, Job was an upright man, not perfect, but God himself said he's a man of integrity. And he did not turn his anger on God, though he did get angry with God. He didn't turn his anger on God, and that's a very significant difference. But notice what he said in verses 1 and 2 of Job chapter 10. You talk about being hopeless. He said, I am disgusted with my life. I mean, he had every right to be disgusted. He's on an ash heap, lost everything. I will express my complaint and speak in the bitterness of my soul. Boy, that's speaking with deep feeling. But notice he said, I will say to God, do not declare me guilty. Let me know why you prosecute me. In other words, he's saying to God, this doesn't make sense. He's still really asking why questions. But at this point in time, he's dialoguing with God. He's talking to God. He's expressing his feelings. Now, really, when you look at these words, they sound somewhat self-righteous. They sound somewhat prideful. But they were not. statements of pride, self-righteousness. There were statements that he was sharing his feelings with God, and remember, God affirmed his integrity. And he's not lost his integrity, though he's going through this horrible, horrible situation. Remember what the Lord said? Just going back to verse 8 of chapter 1, God's affirmation. When the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." Now again, Job was a sinner like we're all sinners, but he was a man of faith and a man following God, a man of honesty. He had a reputation among his friends, his neighbors, those he did business with, as being an honest man and a man of integrity. And Job knew that about himself. And so he's saying, God, why is this happening to me? He's expressing his feelings. Now, here's the point that I think we need to take away here. It's important to realize that God understands these honest feelings. God understands these honest feelings. God is not offended when we share honest feelings. Feelings are not sinful in themselves. It's what we allow these feelings to do that leads us to violate His will. I remember in one instance, I was driving down the main highway in Dallas, Texas. We call it Central Expressway. And I knew that there was a man in a prominent position that was evil. And I knew that he had hurt a lot of people. And I had some evidence about that. And so consequently, I felt led to write a letter to expose him. To expose him to certain individuals. But I ran that letter by a couple of individuals that I really trusted, who said, Gene, this is not the right moment to do that. We're not doubting what you're saying, but if you do that at this moment, it will be totally misinterpreted. You need to wait. And I backed off. And I didn't want to back off. But I listened. He turned out, by the way, to be right. But the point is, I remember driving down Central Expressway talking to God and saying, God, when are you going to get him? When are you going to expose him? He's hurting a lot of people. And then I said, thanks for listening, Lord. I know you're God, but thanks for listening. This is how I feel. I felt like I had some righteous anger that I needed to express. And the important thing is that I believe that God really, from the illustrations we have in the book of Job, that God really understood that. And by the way, these men turned out to be right because eventually God pulled the plug. And when He pulled the plug, this man was exposed totally. And it was the right moment. And by the way, I was not associated with the exposure. So God was protecting me. And I could see that in hindsight. So what I'm illustrating, it's not wrong to share our feelings with God. The fact of the matter is, we can share those feelings, but we must remember that we mustn't allow those angry feelings then to lead us into sin. And that's why Paul said, be angry and don't sin. By the way, here's something very, very important about Job in the whole book. He never cursed God or anyone else. In the midst of all of his pain and all of his suffering and sharing all of his pain with the Lord and with his friends, he never cursed God. Even his wife said, curse God and die. And he said, you're a foolish lady. He never succumbed to that. Do you think he had feelings to do that? I think he probably did. But he never did. He said, I want to die, but he never cursed God. So we have a great example there. So here's this principle that's very important. When we are distressed, confused, and frustrated with life circumstances, we should feel free to share our true feelings with God. And this principle is verified in the New Testament. Let me give you just perhaps a little different spin on some of the verses that we so frequently share with each other. For example, 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter said, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him because he cares about you. Now, when you look at Job, even in the midst of sharing his anxiety and his fears and all of his pain, I don't think we can accuse him of being proud or arrogant. He was a humbled man sitting on that ash heap. But he was also casting all his care upon the Lord. So many times we think of this as just positively sharing our cares. I think it includes our negative feelings too, casting all of our cares upon him. And that simply means everything that we're going through. And that's what Job illustrates. I think we have this illustrated also in Philippians chapter 4. Don't worry about anything, but in everything. And that includes everything Job was sharing, right? Don't be anxious or worry about anything, but in everything through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God which surpasses every thought will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And ultimately that happened to Job. Not immediately. But I think we have here an illustration of how important it is to be able to share our feelings with God. So here's a reflection and response question. In what ways can our feelings of anxiety and fear, anger and hopelessness move from appropriate expressions and become sinful actions? And in some respects, that's a little difficult to answer that question, except to say, Paul gives us certainly a very direct statement when he said, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Now, he doesn't mean a 24-hour day, because you might get angry an hour before the sun goes down. What he's simply saying is, don't allow anger to linger and turn into bitterness and become vengeful. Because the moment anger becomes vengeful, then we're moving into the realm of violating the will of God. And that's a very, very important guideline. We mustn't let it linger and feed that anger. I know people, I pray for this one individual particularly, who has bitterness and anger towards her husband because of what he did to her. Now divorced. But she is just so bitter and so angry. And someday, hopefully soon, I hope I can say, let go of that. Let God deal with that. Yes, he definitely wronged you. But don't be vindictive, because you will only hurt yourself ultimately. Because that's what vindictiveness does. Lack of forgiveness. So we need to be very, very careful. I just wrote down these thoughts in relationship to sharing our feelings with God, and it's simply this, and I've prayed these prayers, or this prayer. Lord, I'm thankful I can share these negative thoughts and feelings with you. And by the way, Father, you know what they are anyway. I'm not fooling anybody. So if God knows what they are, then we might as well share them. And that enables us then to deal with it more objectively and to handle that anger and keep that anger from turning into bitterness.